Aaron, welcome to
Well,
the Remnant.
Steve, it's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited for this conversation. As you know, I am a regular listener to the School of War podcast. I learned so much about it because you do so many different things with the podcast. One week it'll be a sort of fresh from the battlefield analysis of what's happening in Ukraine and the changes that we've seen in warfare from real experts there. And then the next thing you know, we'll be talking about the Revolutionary War or a battle from World War II. So I am certainly no expert. I appreciate the opportunity to listen in and be sort of an amateur observer to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. We got to this method with the podcast by following the strategic principle of maximal self-indulgence. So I basically just select topics based on what I'm most interested in and people who have said or written something recently that seems interesting to me. And I've sort of stumbled upon a niche that for which there's just not a lot of competition. There's a ton of history podcasts out there that do a great job on sort of, what happened at the Battle of Agincourt and what happened in Italy in 1943 and things like that. And then obviously there's all sorts of excellent current events podcasts to include podcasts that focus on defense policy and strategy and things like that. But one that kind of zips back and forth and tries to find the combination or the connections between the two is the space we've come to rest in. And it's a lot of fun.
How did you come to be interested in this?
Well, I grew up sort of immersed in military history, I guess you could say. Sort of unusually for someone my age, my dad fought in World War II. He was drafted in 1943 and fought, 1942 actually, and by 1943 found himself in North Africa, then Italy, France, fought all his way through to Germany. And so when I was a kid in the 1980s, like my worldview was formed by having this guy in the house who, as best as I could tell, there'd been this really bad guy named Adolf Hitler who tried to take over the world and kill all the Jews. And my dad had stopped him. And like that was like my foundational way of looking at things. And it's acquired nuance over time. And I came to realize that there were some other people there, many of whom I knew, family friends. It's how I understood it when I was, say, 7 or 8 years old. But it was foundational. And so I just grew up with it. I grew up with the Army. My dad was retired by the time I was born, but just the sort of knowledge of military life. And I served myself after 9/11. And, I have this impression in terms of the podcast specifically that the study of military history is in pretty bad shape in the American educational system. I remember my personal illustration of this is I had a brilliant AP US history teacher when I was in high school, Kevin Kelly. If you're out there, Kevin, it's been a while, but he was great and we all loved him and he was very charismatic and very knowledgeable. And we spent weeks and weeks on the causes of the Civil War and, the crisis of the 1850s and everything. And it was all very interesting. And then I remember him saying literally, and then the Civil War happened and the North won. And that's all. And that's all you need to know. That's all you need to know. And, so that was because the AP test would never ask you any questions about the war itself. And then in college, obviously, at some point, probably has to do with Vietnam in the 60s and everything. Being a serious scholar of war itself started to become something suspicious. If you studied war, you must be somehow for war. You must be a war fanboy or something. And so, you'll find a fair number of people who sort of say they study military history on college campuses these days, but they tend to study or things like the sociology of war or war's impact on, different out of favor groups or groups of relatively weak people and things like that. Oh, by the way, totally legitimate subjects of study, depending on the details, but not the thing itself. And so it felt like it might be valuable to make a contribution on that front. And the really nice thing about it is discovering that there's a big audience out there in the military. Folks, I mean, we have a lot of serious professionals in the U.S. military, folks who have decided to make their career as an officer or a non-commissioned officer. And they're really hungry for opportunities to think rigorously about what war is, how it happens, how the past informs today, all that kind of stuff.
Well, I want to get back to your claim that Adolf Hitler was a bad guy. That seems to be, once again, contentious claim, particularly on some modern right-wing podcasts. But I'm interested. I mean, I've got about a million questions just picking up on what you've said there. How much has your doing the podcast opened doors for you to people who are involved with what's happening today in the U.S. government, at the Pentagon and elsewhere? The people that you mentioned who are hungry for the kind of discussions that you have on the podcast. Has it contributed to you building relationships with them? Has it helped you become more informed in your understanding of what's happening today?
I think it's found a listenership in some influential places, which is nice. And I've been around for a little while, not counting the podcast, so I have my own friends and relationships, and a lot of people serving, doing important work for the country in the administration. And I'm hopeful it provides some service and some framing and some help there. I mean, there's a real sort of I don't know if battle is exactly the right word, but there's definitely a competition within the Trump administration for what the Trump foreign policy is, which in a way seems strange because in the second term, the president is so obviously dominant, even more so than he was in the first term, and important decisions really do reside with him. So maybe it's more accurate to say that the competition is to some extent about the present, but it's also really about the future, and what the post-Trump GOP is going to adopt as its foreign policy. And it's complicated. There are a bunch of different schools of thought. I always tell people who are trying to, often foreign visitors will ask for sort of an orientation to how to think about the Trump approach to foreign policy. And I think there are at least four schools that you have to account for in any analysis of a debate within the administration. And these are sort of reductive and 30,000 feet. And I don't know how many human beings are fully in one and not at least some of the other camps. But speaking reductively, there are a couple groups that were just not well represented. They weren't represented at all really before Trump's first term. And even in the first term, not super well represented, but are this time around. So that's the group one would be the old school, right-wing, libertarian, I'll say isolationists. They tend to grade at that term. They prefer things like non-interventionist. It's about the same thing. The probably the most prominent figure who's associated with this kind of thing is actually not in the administration. It'd be someone like Senator Rand Paul in the Senate. So, dedicated, just to put it in the terms with which they would defend themselves, I think, dedicated to preserving Republican virtue, in part by disentangling America from all this messy stuff we're involved in overseas, but committed to a kind of liberalism, typically committed to things like free markets and relatively lenient approaches to immigration, et cetera. And that's group one. Not super prominently represented in term two, but certainly there. Group
There
two,
have
much
been. I mean, some of the people, I would say, just to jump in, some of the people in senior ranks of the Pentagon who were there at the beginning and are no longer there were sort of this school. And I'll leave it to you to tell us whether we should read anything more into that. But continue, share with us the other three groups.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's sort of mid-level Pentagon staff who definitely, I mean, important mid-level Pentagon staff, mid to high level staff who sort of come from this world and the world of organizations and funders that back it. But group two kind of dwarfs them, I think, in significance, even though it often ends up in similar policy positions. But that's sort of the MAGA populists. So this would be, let's say, Steve Bannon's worldview and foreign policy. Certainly not, traditionally interventionist or traditionally Republican in any way, but more hawkish on China, probably more hawkish on Latin America, I would say. Obviously, Venezuela is in the news right now. Group one, my libertarian isolationists, I think they were probably happy when they heard that the Trump administration was planning to focus on the Western Hemisphere, because for them it's great. Like, it means we're going to disentangle ourselves from all that other stuff. Well, it turns out, first of all, we're not really disentangling. Second of all, when the Trump administration focuses on the Western Hemisphere, it turns out it really focuses on the Western Hemisphere. And I think they're sort of sitting there right now saying, "Oh no, we didn't mean like this, not like this."
Right.
But group two, the MAGA guys, I think, perfectly comfortable with this. And then the distinction between groups one and group two, it's probably clearest when you talk about Ukraine, because they actually want something very similar. They want American disengagement. They want the war to end. Group one, I think, for sort of traditional, let's wash our hands of this dirty foreign business reasons. But group two, I think, the populists, um, they want Ukraine to lose. They have a vision of world order in which Ukraine is a kind of outpost of liberal imperium. And they're kind of the bad guys. I mean, I'm sort of oversimplifying and maybe going a bit further than some of these guys would be willing to
You
in
can
a public forum.
absolutely pull that from their rhetoric. No, I mean, I think it's clear, depending on who you're talking about and depending on who you're including in that group. Certainly, there are examples of rhetoric, and I would say policy decisions that point strongly in that direction.
Absolutely, but this is the difference between them and the kind of the more old-fashioned libertarian isolationists is their vision of world order is different. It's not just that America is going to disentangle itself, or maybe not even, it may not even be a fair thing to say about their policy vision. Their policy vision is that we need, these are my words, not theirs, but I think it sums it up. We need something like a new Holy Alliance, like a new concert of Vienna post Napoleonic Wars order for the world, where the great powers, the United States, Russia, by the way, China kind of starts to fit into this if you can solve some minor problems like the fact that it's a socialist state. Like that's, we're going to impose world order through a concert of great powers, all three of which have in common, by the way, their antipathy to liberalism, because MAGA America is sort of post-liberal America. And the true enemies are the liberals. And we need to link arms and defeat the liberals. And that's the vision. And it's hard, it sounds kind of loony to say it like that in a lot of places. So you don't always hear it said, but I think that's where the logic goes. And just to be quick, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but before you jump to group 3 and 4, can you give us some examples of people that you would include in group 3 beyond Steve Bannon? Would you include J.D. Vance in group 2?
He's never said some of the things I just said, so I hesitate to go entirely that far. On the other hand, you look at his speech in Munich back towards the beginning of this year, where he pretty clearly said that there's a way of looking at Russia-European tensions and seeing the Europeans, as the bad guys, because of your assaults on free speech, et cetera, et cetera. It's a bit complicated, because that's kind of a liberal critique to mount. That you guys are attacking free speech. But I mean, he's closer to that camp, I think, than he is to some of the others in my my list.
And I think if you look at his rhetoric, if you look at his rhetoric on Ukraine specifically, I mean, he comes as close to anybody in the administration, with the possible exception occasionally of the president himself, to articulating that sort of hostility, that antipathy toward Ukraine. I mean, he's famously told Tucker Carlson before he was vice president that he didn't care what happened in Ukraine. And I think in some ways, that's kind of the warmest thing he said about Ukraine. And you look at his role in the Zelensky blow up, the Oval Office meeting back in February, and the kinds of things that he's said even recently. He had some social media posts in which he, in effect, said we shouldn't care about Ukraine the way that we care about Ukraine. I would put him, I mean, we haven't gotten to 3 and 4 yet, but he seems to me to fit in group 2 pretty comfortably, particularly, as you say, because of the post-liberal views that the people in group 2 hold. And he, I think, in some ways is the avatar of those, at least from the perspective of elected Republicans.
Yeah, it's certainly the case. Certainly the case that there's a deep link between views of domestic policy and the future of America, right, as a project, and what our foreign policy ought to be for all of these schools. And you're right. I mean, there's a big dose of post-liberalism, certainly for the people around the vice president. I don't think it's an accident that the Secretary of the Army, Secretary Driscoll, played a central role in the last few weeks with this last run at a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, which, in my view, got off to a pretty alarming start. I mean, the text of those 28 points that leaked to the media was not, I think, an acceptable deal. I mean, I think it was literally not an acceptable deal in the sense that I don't think the Ukrainians could possibly have accepted it. And the danger that the president has always put himself by making this claim that he could solve the war in a day, right, was that, well, the fastest way, if really left with no other options, if speed is really your priority, the fastest way is probably to try to bully Ukraine into some kind of surrender. And it looked for a few days like that was the road we were on. The administration pulled out of that dive, as it has in the past. Generally speaking, when the administration sort of sees something through, it's not entirely been to the pleasure of the kind of people who want to see Ukraine defeated, and we seem to be in a better and different place now. But those 28 demands included some crazy stuff. I mean, some really crazy,
Yes.
and also like weirdly unnecessary stuff about, the American nuclear arsenal and all, and things that sort of made promises on behalf of NATO and European countries that we're not really in a position to offer. It was craziness. But I think actually both my libertarian isolationists and my MAGA populists probably happier with it than not.
I think that's very true. Group 3. Who's Group 3?
They're the traditional Republicans. They're there. They're there. So you can call them what you want. GOP hawks, people who, broadly speaking, embrace the post-1945 world order with modifications and amendments and new rhetorical emphases, but broadly speaking, see a role for America both in the Western Hemisphere and in Eurasia, who kind of have the view that we could probably do both. You might even think that we've neglected the Western Hemisphere, which, by the way, I think is a totally legitimate thing to think. But at the same time, just have obligations for our own security in Eurasia, in particular in its far western end, in Europe and its far eastern end in East Asia. And every Republican, every American president has always on some level wanted to get out of the Middle East. But I would say this school sort of accepts that's easier said than done. And we also have interests there. And the president, obviously, in some of the decisions he's made with regard to the Middle East, is not, totally separate from this group. But then that's my fourth group, this is the one you really have to account for. It's Trump himself. And Trump is not a member of any of these three groups. He has created a party in an administration where groups 1 and 2 have a role and have a voice and have certainly the second group, major seats at the table. Even more so than in the first term. But he is his own guy. His own worldview is distinct from all three of these. It obviously involves economics and business to a much greater extent. The people who are sort of the closest avatars to his own thinking seem to be people like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who are in Moscow as we speak, with whatever this latest iteration of the peace effort for Ukraine is. And the president, is not an isolationist. He's also not a traditional interventionist. And I think he, as a result, the people from these different groups who sort of at any given time allow themselves to invest, invest their hopes. It's a roller coaster experience because any given day you wake up, after the strikes on the Iranian nuclear program and the hostage deal to get the living hostages out of Gaza, which was an incredible act of statecraft, no matter how you cut it. I think a lot of people in Group 3 were like getting their MAGA tattoos on their back, because like, what's there to complain about? Like 2025 is working out pretty well. And then you wake up one morning and we're promising to limit our nuclear arsenal, despite the Chinese buildup as part of a sort of cockamamie peace deal with Russia over Ukraine, and all of a sudden that's a bit of a splash of cold water in the face, and it's just a lot going on. It's like a busy year, Steve.
So let me ask you. I want to push back on something you just said about Trump. Do you think he has a worldview?
Yeah, I think there are some consistent elements to his view of things. He's not a traditional politician, obviously, and he brings different experiences and different baggage than most traditional politicians do. He's been very consistent over the years on trade. And he's been very consistent, I think, on sort of a nuance there of the centrality of trade in his view of other things. America, my a sort of flippant way I have of explaining it, which at some level actually I think is true, is if the president walked in, if he got a time machine and he walked into a board meeting of the East India Company in the year 1820, he would feel entirely at home because he would get it. He would get what we're talking about here. We are in the business of business, and there is a kind of There's only a very hazy line between British private enterprise and the British state. They kind of exist in a symbiosis, and that's what we're here to do. That's what we're here to promote. We are here to make money. Doesn't mean we're pacifists necessarily, but it also doesn't necessarily mean that we are we're certainly not isolationists, and we're interventionists not for moral reasons, but for reasons of economic interest to sort of stick with this. I think he would be at home in that confirmation. That's right. Well, I think the Russians certainly hope that that's the case and seem to be constructing a lot of their outreach to Trump world on that basis. But the problem, it's funny. I sort of I had this thought after the Alaska summit, Steve. You have what's obviously this fairly sophisticated outreach spearheaded by this guy, Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, to build bridges with people on Trump's team, and sort of, interest them in the business opportunities that will flourish should America and Russia be able to make peace. And, I think
had been sanctioned by the U.S. government. We should point out
these are all bad guys. All these Russians are bad, and I think J.D. Vance was right when he said on stage a few weeks ago, shocking as the formulation was, that like the president's view of Ukraine is that why don't you people stop fighting and just make some money? It was like a inopportune formulation because obviously it's a little bit like saying to your neighbor who's suffering a home invasion, why don't you guys just stop fighting? But the notion that we should stop fighting to make some money, I think, is like a fair estimate of the governing worldview here. That said, the Russians sort of obviously have this outreach to try to lean into that and use it to their advantage, and obviously make progress here and there. But then I feel like every time Putin actually kind of gets into the room, and I think this is on some level what happened in Alaska, according to the reports that came out of the summit, was, the table's all been set for a deal. We're going to talk business. We're going to talk, energy. Kirill Dmitriev, Steve, posted a video today about on Twitter or X about building a tunnel between Alaska and Siberia. So like that's where the sort of the influence operation is at. But then Putin gets into the room and he starts lecturing about, 18th century dukes and the agreements they made about, different river valleys in the steppe. And, he screws it up. He screws it up because he's like monomaniacally focused on his vision of Russian imperialism. It seems to be his worldview. And so that's, of course, the danger for us is the Russians are setting us up to think that actually they can adopt a kind of Trump worldview of doing business. But the guy actually running Russia, and I think a lot of the people around him, are ruthless ideologues. And it's a dangerous situation.
It's been interesting to watch the evolution of the U.S. position and the things that our top Trump administration officials have said in public. I remember watching Secretary of State Marco Rubio on the tarmac. I believe it was in Saudi Arabia. This is in February, very early on in these discussions when it had been obvious. I think it was obvious to most of us even before this that the Russia-Ukraine conflict wouldn't be solved in a day. But I think there were aspirations in the administration, the highest levels of the administration, that it could be solved quickly. And Marco Rubio led with something that I just found stunning as somebody who's covered him closely ever since he's been in public life, held out the possibility in his public statements of this sort of rebirth of U.S.-Russia business relationships and sort of the United States playing an active and eager role in catapulting Russia to economic greatness once again. Those are my words, not his. But that seems to me that was clearly behind the kinds of things he was saying. And I think when we see what we're seeing from the Russians, I think they understand that, it's not just Donald Trump who's saying this. Trump has his, the people who are guiding his decision making, giving him advice. The people in the last people in the room when he's talking all seem to have adopted this as a potential path out of what has been this horrendous conflict. To what extent do you think somebody like Marco Rubio? I mean, you have followed Marco Rubio closely as well. Watched him from the Senate. where does he fit in your sort of four different groups? And do you think that the way that he's conducted himself reflects where he lives in those groups, or is he mostly just serving the president?
Secretary Rubio is engaged in a project and has been for some years, actually, about what it means to negotiate a kind of fusion between MAGA populism, or just populism, maybe, and traditional conservatism. And you can see that in the way his views have crystallized, not just on foreign policy, but on economic policy. So I don't think he's so easily put in a box. If anything, like I say, I think he's sort of consciously thinking through what it means to speak to and lead, within multiple boxes, less the sort of first isolationist one, but certainly both the populist and the traditional conservative one. And he's a cabinet officer for Donald Trump. So of course, on some level, they all serve at the pleasure of the president. I mean, the problem that this vision that the president obviously wants, and the people working for him, on some level have to embrace, with a kind of happy business relationship with Russia being the outcome of all this, is that Putin, it seems to me, is not willing. I mean, Putin will not actually meet the president halfway. Putin wants Ukraine, and Putin wants to split NATO, and he wants security outcomes that are driven by, at core, ideological factors in his mind, and he's not willing to give those up. If he could actually just ease off a bit, if he could agree to just freezing
the half step,
totally, he could make a lot more progress with this administration, but he just won't do it. I mean, you could argue, and there are very smart Russia analysts who say he's constrained by Russian domestic politics. Maybe that's true, but he's clearly not willing to meet these guys halfway. And the reason why I think the administration keeps kind of pulling out of these concerning dives on Ukraine, of course, you say something like this, who knows what we wake up to tomorrow, is I do think on some level the president, he likes to be successful in these foreign gambits. The strike on the Iranian nuclear program was successful. The hostage deal was actually an incredible accomplishment out of Gaza. That's good for the president. Americans like that. To the extent that Americans pay attention to foreign policy, they like America to win, not lose, and they like to feel safer, not less safe. And there's a way in which giving, really forcing the Ukrainians into some kind of surrender, or probably more likely getting them to the point where they balk and they say, screw it. Sorry, America, we can't go where you want us to go. We're just going to keep going without you. That leads pretty quickly, I think, to a scenario where you have a really bad battlefield situation for Ukraine. And I don't think that reflects politically well on the Trump administration or the president. And I think he knows that. It's a world which feels less safe week by week. And so we keep not going there. And
you think he does know that? You think he does? Is that what? So I think, what you have just described, I think, is exactly where we are. That's maybe the best description I've heard of where we are right now. And it feels like that kind of policy collapse, to me, is almost imminent. I mean, it's just short of inevitable, where the Ukrainians are now, after this 28-point peace proposal that was alternately a Russian proposal, a U.S. proposal, a U.S.-Russian proposal. I mean, the varying descriptions of how it came to be, what it represented, who supported it, who didn't, I think generated enough confusion that we should all be skeptical of what was happening in that sort of diplomatic cycle. But it feels to me now that the Ukrainians are engaged with the United States. They keep, there'll be hours-long meetings. They emerge from these meetings, no tangible, obvious progress you can point to, but kind of endless optimism from the Ukrainians. And it feels totally and completely forced to me. Like, they don't have reason to be optimistic about what was just said in these meetings. And all they're doing at this point is sort of putting off this, again, not inevitable, but increasingly feeling inevitable point at which they say, we're done. We can't do this. We need the United States. We can't win without the United States. We can't achieve a favorable outcome without the United States. But now they're pushing too far. They're asking us to accept too much. We're out. I think you can see evidence of that in, again, in the initial reaction to the 28-point plan, where you look at what Zelensky said, and that was about as blunt as he's been about anything since the meeting that blew up in the Oval Office. And you look at European leaders, they too, it seems, had almost come to that point. This is what you keep referring to as the dives. They come to this point where they say, I think this might be it, and then slowly walk back and engage the diplomacy. Is there sort of a triggering mechanism that you can see on the horizon for the moment where European leaders and Zelensky and those others just say, too much, we can't do it?
Well, that depends on what we're asking, right? And that depends on, what the president is actually willing to force past this point of friction. And so far, the evidence on the table is that he kind of steps back when we reach this really bumpy point where it looks like, just to, keep going with the metaphor, like the plane's about to go into the dirt. Like, we do step back, and we have, again, it's just impossible to say where we're going to be sitting this time in 2026. It feels like 2025 has been about 10 years long, Steve. And we've got we got 3 more to go, which is good for those of us in the
all
business.
of this gray hair just came this year.
That said, we now have 5 years of a Trump administration to draw inferences from. And the fact is that NATO is still there. We've never actually really crossed the kinds of lines that would compel the Ukrainians to say, sorry, we have no choice. Like, our survival, our domestic politics, whatever, just don't allow us to go that far. And I don't, you asked me, if I know this for sure. I don't know for sure that the reason that the president doesn't cross that line is this sense that it would be bad for him, but he seems to have some political skill, to me, to put it mildly. And again, Americans don't, when Americans don't think about foreign policy in the way that people who work at the Dispatch or whatever think tanks in Washington D.C. think about foreign policy. They think about it, of course, when it intersects with them personally. So when America gets attacked, for example, they think about foreign policy for obvious reasons. Or when it affects prices, they think about foreign policy. But a very important feature of how Americans react to foreign policy is they know whether or not they feel safe. And a Europe that is going off the rails, a Europe where Ukraine is falling to Russia, where the Europeans are probably in this scenario starting to turn on each other, because you don't have, despite some of the nice sounding rhetoric, you don't have unanimity amongst the Europeans, obviously, about what to do about Russia. That's a world that's obviously kind of going off the rails, and it doesn't play well. It doesn't play well. Of all the risks, that the Trump administration, all the plates, it wants to spin at any given moment, why you would choose to put yourself into that scenario, it just seems very self-harming to me. And so I speculate that's got to be a factor. I hope it is.
Yeah. Can you walk us through what it would mean if we got to that point, and if the United States sort of withdrew its, say, intelligence support for Ukrainians, which has been pretty consistent, even through these dives? What would that look like if the United States just bailed? If Ukraine said, this is too much, you're asking us to swallow too much, and there was this break?
Yeah, I mean, a Ukraine without ongoing military support, that's relying purely on the Europeans. And again, I sort of predict that the European support would start to fracture, and you'd get a very complicated European situation in this world too. I think there's a Ukraine that starts to lose with at an increasing clip on the battlefield. Unfortunately, I mean, I wish that weren't the case. The technology of the day sort of favor the warfighting technology sort of favors the defense. That is to say, the battlefield of 2025 is a place where it's kind of hard to move. So if you're the guy standing still and you want to hold the line, that's good for you. The sort of
why is that? Can you explain that?
Yeah. Well, we are late in a revolution in warfighting technology that is been about the integration of information technology into the business of combat. This goes all the way back to the Cold War, with the creation of what, you'll hear it described as precision strike complexes or reconnaissance strike complexes. It goes by all kinds of different names. The Russians actually conceptualized it before we did, interestingly enough. But it sort of emerges into the public consciousness with the first Gulf War. If you think back, Steve, to Norman Schwarzkopf standing there, I for the record have only vague recollections of this. I was very young, but if you think back to Norman Schwarzkopf standing there on the podium showing these sort of whiz bang videos of the American Air Force bombing individual Iraqi tanks successfully, that was really new. The precision and the efficiency with which we were able to do that with the new sensor technology and the ability to run this cycle where we could find the targets and then precisely kill them at a rapid clip, that was new. That was based on IT coming into the military and creating these networks where the sensors could send information back to the planners, and the planners could send out the kinds of weapons that had real precision, right? America then kind of dominated this game for a while. And the world noticed, the Chinese noticed what we had just done to the Iraqis. And they said, oh, we need to get our act together. We need to develop our own versions of this technology so we can run these sensor strike complexes as well. And where we sit in 2025 is a world where not only do all the major powers have this technology where they can see the battlefield really well, and then they can reach out and touch things on the battlefield quickly and efficiently and precisely. But everyone and their mother has it too. The Houthis are running a sensor strike complex in the Red Sea where they can find these ships and reach out and strike them. So you don't have to be a major power to have these kinds of capabilities. And where we are in a place like Ukraine is you have the Russians and the Chinese Russians and the Ukrainians, though the Chinese obviously playing a role, by the way, and supplying a lot of stuff to the Russians, in a stalemate where both sides can see the battlefield really well. Both sides can strike precisely, and the technology over the years has proliferated, and it's gotten cheaper and cheaper, such that really small stuff available to you don't need F-18s to do this anymore. You can do this with digital cameras in drones, right? So even small infantry units can kind of run their own versions of sensor strike complexes. All of which is to say, in 2025, it's really hard to move around the battlefield without getting blown up. That's good if you're defending, but it can be overwhelmed. No one's really cracked the code yet on the sort of big operational method that's going to overwhelm it spectacularly in the way that, after World War I, the Germans kind of cracked the code with Blitzkrieg. How do you get through the machine gun and barbed wire and all this stuff? It's with this combination of tanks and aircraft and radios and things like that becomes Blitzkrieg. No one's, as of right now, demonstrated that they know how to do that. But with mass and attrition, you can slowly roll your way forward. The Russians are already slowly rolling forward. So my prediction, Steve, is they'll roll forward faster. They'll roll forward faster, and the consequences will start to be grim.
Do you, when you sort of take a step back and look at now what's almost been 4 years of the Russian war of aggression in Ukraine, much has been made sort of public discussions about the changes in warfare in that distinct defined period. I was listening to your recent episode with Mick Ryan. Fascinating discussion about recent changes in Ukraine and what's happening on the battlefield today. I was surprised to hear him express some skepticism that this new way of war in Ukraine, particularly with respect to drones, has been as transformative as some other observers might have led us to believe. What did you make of his comments, or am I misinterpreting them?
No, I think I think what Mick, who's a brilliant guy, was trying to do was just introduce a bit of reserve into what can sometimes be a breathless conversation that's over-indexed, particularly on the drone. The notion that the drone is sort of the beginning and the end of every conversation about warfare, which does overstate it. It's a factor. It's one factor among many. And by the way, this is a feature of military revolutions. When new things come onto the scene, new technologies come onto the scene in warfare, typically what happens is everyone thinks they've discovered it. They've discovered the killer technology that will change warfare forever. There's no answer to it. The power that masters it will cut through the other powers like a hot knife through butter. And as a consequence, by the way, they tend to think war is going to be quick. All the wars will move very quickly because of this
Cleaner,
new
quicker.
technology.
Yeah.
And this story plays out, over and over again. Aviation, nuclear weapons, in a way, you could tell this. It changes everything. Warfare is kind of, as we know it, is over, etc. Well, not really, because with each technology, there are all sorts of nuclear weapons. It's the case that actually maybe you don't want to use them, but you still want to fight war. So everyone has to figure out how to live in that world. But with other kinds of technology, there's always countermeasures to the technology. There's always tactics that make the weapon less, or the technology less potent than it might first have been dreamed to be. The bomber is probably a classic example of this, right? In the lead up to World War II, if you read if you read what the Brits were saying about strategic bombing in the lead up to the war, they talk about it as in the way that we talk about nuclear bombing in the Cold War or today. Like, it's just going to end cities, and no country will be able to absorb blows like that. And the bomber will always get through, and the bomber will be decisive. Well, not really, as it turned out. The bomber was a factor. It was an important factor, but it wasn't as decisive as its proponents thought it was going to be.
So how big a change have we seen in your view?
Well, the drone, I mean, and the sort of, it's not, again, the drone is sort of one element of a broader democratization. It's not a perfect term for it, but a kind of proliferation,
Evening
democratization,
out, yeah.
cheapening, massifying
Yeah.
of the same concepts that were at work in the Gulf War. But in the Gulf War, you needed, the really expensive high-end platforms to make it work. Now, again, sort of small infantry units can kind of engage in these highly precise loops, targeting loops, to include with all, AI. We want to talk about things that I think people are over-indexing on a bit. It's, AI. AI is sort of increasingly available at the tactical level for various applications. So that's, I think, probably the most significant change. And then I think the change we're all waiting for is who's going to crack the code on how to still move around the battlefield under these conditions. I think we get some clues on that out of the Middle East. I mean, I think Hamas on October the 7th defeated a pretty sophisticated military and a pretty technology-heavy defensive complex on the Israeli side, which deserves, I mean, they're studying a lot in Israel. I think it deserves a lot more study here. And then the Israelis did a pretty good job both with Hezbollah in the fall of 24 and then with Iran itself during the 12-day war in overwhelming defensive systems that seemed pretty potent on paper and turned out not to be so potent when you acted with surprise and successful deception campaigns and a lot of very high quality intelligence collection. So, it's I think that the next step is, how are you going to reintroduce maneuver to the battlefield? That's what everyone's trying to figure out.
I want to spend a few minutes on some other headlines of the day, and as you say, there's much to talk about. Are we at war? Is the United States at war in the Caribbean right now?
That seems to be the legal premise of the Trump administration's actions, right? It's a bit like post 9/11, when we, sort of defined entities like Al Qaeda as state-like entities, or entities engaging in state-like acts of war, such that we could wage war on them. And the basic premise of the Trump administration here is that cartels and the sort of synthesis, the cooperation of cartels with various problematic Central and South American regimes, Venezuela being obviously the one that's really in the crosshairs sitting here today, that creates the justification for military action, which is what we're seeing. We're seeing military action, not law enforcement action. I actually think, certainly on the right, the administration is kind of pushing on an open door in terms of political popularity. I mean, the notion that drug traffickers are, sort of beyond the kind of treatment that they're getting at the hands of the U.S. military is kind of a tough position to defend at a purely political level, even if the legal arguments are stronger. But I have friends on both sides of this conversation. I'm not sure he said it publicly, so I won't quote him. But a friend with long service in the Navy, who had some experience chasing down these drug boats himself, with more of a law enforcement approach during his time as an officer in this part of the world. Talks about how when intelligence was certain that this or that boat was absolutely a drug trafficking boat. Well, sometimes it wasn't. And sometimes not everybody on the boat was a drug trafficker. And this person feels very strongly that what's going on is, problematic at the least, in consequence. That said, if this is what hemispheric defense means, going after drug traffickers, I think is sort of going to be a popular position for the administration in the long run.
What are the alleged acts of war? I think this is hugely problematic. I think all of these strikes are illegal. I'm not an expert, but certainly the people that I know and trust are pretty consistent about that. So I'm asking this from a particular point of view. But given the most charitable interpretation of what we're seeing, what are the alleged acts of war that these people we're killing have committed, number one? And number two, we know strikingly little about who these people are. Is there an obligation that the U.S. government has, that the Department of Defense has, to at least share some of the intelligence, more of the intelligence that we've seen about who these people are, in justifying why we're killing them?
Yeah, so I guess the generous interpretation would be that these cartels as organizations, right, are responsible for the deaths of large numbers of Americans, mostly through the drugs themselves, but also through acts of violence. To your point about, doesn't the administration have an obligation? This is a curious feature of how this administration does business. And you saw it in the Middle East context as well, by the way, where I was pretty pleased actually with what ultimately happened with regard to Iran and the results. But you didn't
So
see
was I.
a great deal of work done to build a case. You saw some sort of after the fact explanations from the president and others in the administration, but and obviously when things go well, it's kind of politically advantageous to take credit, but you didn't see a lot of building of the case beforehand in the way that you might otherwise have expected. And so we're seeing the same thing here. You do see, you'll see people comment in the administration that this is good for military purposes. Why would we show our hands? Why would we let the other guy, know what we're up to? Our plans will become known in time. And I guess as a question of military strategy, there's a case to be made for that. But there's a political level as well. When it comes to Venezuela, which is obviously kind of the question on everyone's mind right now, like what's going to happen next? Look, I mean, you're not going to get me to defend Maduro and the Maduro regime, which is sort of richly deserving of what might be in store for it. You have Venezuela as indeed an important part of the broader drug puzzle, even if not really the source, I think, of most of the drugs. And you do have, cartel roles there. You have it as a platform for Russian,
Sure.
Chinese, even Iranian influence.
Iranian.
You have Maduro himself as illegitimate authoritarian leader. You have a real recipe there. A very traditional Republican thing to do would be to take a hard line against a regime like this. But to make a kind of stupid, superficial observation, Venezuela is a really big country. And Maduro has been there for a while. So, it's clear that the kind of diplomatic pressure that this administration, to include in the first term, has put on him over the years hasn't worked so far. That seems clear. So we're up in the heat here. And I don't know what's going to come next any more than anyone else does. But there are risks here. And this is all coming back to your point, Steve. It would probably be valuable to really lay out clearly the case for what's going on and why it's necessary, if only because things might go wrong. This administration has pulled a couple of strategic rabbits out of the hat so far this year. It's entirely possible they're going to do it again. I'm not familiar with what the operation plan is for whatever's coming next. But some explanation would probably be valuable.
When you look at the case that people are making who are in favor of. Look, I don't know what's coming next either in Venezuela. You're in a much better position to offer some smart speculation about that than I am. But certainly, if you read between the lines, with the president talking about closing the airspace, with findings or potential intelligence activity in preparation for ground troops, folks on the ground, causing trouble for the Maduro regime, stands to reason that something's afoot. I'm struck, and I wonder if you are, by to the extent that we are getting a case, there are echoes of the case for preemption from sort of 2002 era Bush administration arguments on Iraq. And I find it somewhat ironic. I bought those arguments in 2002. I still think there is a good case for preemption. And the mistake I think some people, certainly in retrospect, make in analyzing the Bush administration's case is they assume erroneously that the Bush administration wanted to prove imminence of the threat before preempting. It was precisely the opposite, that you couldn't wait till the threat was imminent. But I think there are echoes of that case then that you hear from proponents of what Trump is at least contemplating doing now. And I heard them. You had an interview with Josh Trevino from the Texas Public Policy Foundation, who I think made some of these cases sort of unapologetically for regime change, for removing Maduro. I wonder if I just hear those echoes because I reported so closely on what the Bush administration was doing at those time, or if you hear them too. Should other people hear them?
No, I think that's right. I mean, on some level, I guess it's ironic. I don't know if it's that ironic from the point of view of the president himself, because again, the president's not, he's not an isolationist. He's not. I mean, his rhetoric has certainly embraced and welcomed into the party people for whom the Iraq War is the great evil of American foreign policy. Never
Certainly.
has any greater evil or any more foolish decision ever been made by any statesman ever. I don't personally take the president to go quite that far. And certainly, I agree with you. I mean, there's an obvious logical affinity between the two. And by the way, this is driving the non-interventionists, or whatever we want to call them. It's driving them nuts.
Crazy.
They're furious
Yes.
right now. I confess to a human frailty, Steve, that when I see the editorial board of the American Conservative get really upset about something, that I am more likely to be in favor of it. It's not the most rigorous or intellectually serious way to do business, but I'm human like everyone else. And they're furious about the situation. Again, it's like, yeah, Western hemispheric focus was great when it meant that we're not focusing on other things, but we didn't mean like this. And Donald Trump does mean like this.
But Trump himself, if you go back and look at his campaign rhetoric, I mean, I think that obviously he was used some sleight of hand when he described his own views of the Iraq War at the time. He claims to have been opposed to it all along. He was, in fact, in favor of it and pretty enthusiastic about it in his public comments. This is checkable. These things are facts. But it's also the case that in the time since he ran for president in 2016 and since, he uses rhetoric that is very much like rhetoric that we've heard from some on the pacifist left. He talks about forever wars. He talks about these entanglements. He talks about turning back toward the United States. In some ways, it's sort of a blend of the non-interventionists or the the neo-isolationists and this pacifist left. And I think often implicit, but sometimes explicit, there's a rejection of the doctrine of preemption in his rhetoric and in his thinking, and certainly in the way that those around him articulate their views. And this seems to me to be this just stark contrast. It's like they've said all of this pretty consistently over the years, and now they're in fact doing the opposite. And I would argue with a much more diffuse threat. At the very least, they haven't made the case consistently that this is a threat that requires the kind of preemption that they appear to be contemplating. What am I missing in that. Is my analysis too simplistic?
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, on the question of the president's rhetoric, I mean, look, I think Donald Trump is a very talented politician, and he's built this coalition that has elements that were basically rejected by the GOP, or certainly not serviced by the GOP, until he came to the fore in 2015, 2016. But to the endless frustration of these elements, he's not consistently governed according to that rhetoric. And actually, I'm not a student of his rhetoric on Iraq, but if you pay attention to how he talked about Ukraine in the 2024 timeframe, he was always a little bit more careful than the sort of more full-throated populists who supported him. He never really went as far as, Steve Bannon on Ukraine, and he would tend to fall back on, one, this war would never have started if I had stayed president. Plausible, by the way, at least defensible position. And two, I'll solve it in a day. That's a little bit more out in the limb. But those were kind of his happy rhetorical places. And while I don't think it would be fair to paint him as a supporter of Ukraine exactly in his rhetoric, he was never exactly an enemy of it either. He left himself some space, and in that space, he now operates as the
I would
actual.
say that, just to jump in, I would say that too reflects an evolution of his own either thinking or rhetoric, maybe both, because certainly in the 2019, 2020 timeframe, he was much closer, I would say, to the people in group two you identified at the beginning who held Ukraine as the enemy. He made the case that Ukraine was out to get him, that they worked to sort of ruin his presidency, what have you. I do think you're right as you describe his rhetoric in 2024. There was always a little, it wasn't as strident and as absolutist as I think his earlier rhetoric was, which is sort of interesting on its own.
Yeah, no, he leaves himself room to operate, and so he regularly disappoints these constituencies that he's brought into the party. By the way, also into the administration, by not actually following through their platform to what seems to be to them its logical conclusion. You sort of see this now with the approach to Venezuela, which pleases the populists but really upsets the isolationists. Look, I think, and again, I do think, just back to my point about why I do think so far we've seen these breaks on the Ukraine situation is, I do think the president wants to be successful, and he wants to be perceived to be successful, and he wants to win the Nobel Prize, and he wants Americans to say, look at this guy, he's really good at making deals and being the president. And, is that the worst, rubric to guide you as the president? I don't think so. And so with the big, of course, just the obvious difference between anything that might be about to happen in Venezuela and Iraq is there doesn't seem to me to be any plans for a march on Caracas. We have way more forces assembled off the coast of Venezuela in terms of this. We have an aircraft carrier group and then a marine amphibious group. There's way more forces than you need to do, narcotics interdiction, but it's not enough forces to, seize Caracas or whatever. So something short of that is the plan, to the extent that any military action is contemplated as more than just simply a show of force. And so you'll see something, and I think that's a good thing, by the way. I think it was madness to invade Venezuela in the sort of traditional sense of the term. You do see this kind of reserve and this prudence, honestly, in the way it's conceived, because the guy doesn't want to fail.
I mean, I think we could describe it as prudence in a macro sense, but I think if you look at some of the things that we're seeing with these individual boat strikes, if you look at the campaign more broadly, and the seeming sort of dismissal of the traditional constraints on the use of force, I would describe that as sort of the height of imprudence. What do you make of the, and feel free to challenge that analysis. What do you make of what we've heard from Republicans, particularly over this past weekend, who've been asked about this really explosive Washington Post story from last Friday that there was this, they're calling it a double tap, that when there were two survivors after the initial strike on these alleged narco-terrorist boats on September 2nd, there were two survivors. There was a second strike meant, depending on who you believe, to eliminate the two survivors, and that being, according to Andy McCarthy at National Review, and certainly a lot of people, kind of definition of a violation of the laws of war. Republicans, including Republicans in positions of authority in Congress, have voiced at least some discomfort with this, and some of them have announced that they will be participating in or helping to lead investigations into what we've seen there. The administration's rhetoric and explanations have, to be very charitable, evolved over the past several days, different arguments at different times. What do you make of what you hear from Republicans on Capitol Hill? You spent time there working for Senator Cotton. Where do you expect Republicans will end up on this question specifically?
Well, I think it depends on the facts of what emerges from the inquiries that are being led by people like Senator Wicker at the Senate Armed Services Committee, who's a serious guy. And he's, said publicly that he's taking it seriously. That story really was explosive, the Post story last week. It was also a little bit vague in terms of the timing and precise nature of what had actually happened. It didn't actually say this, but then a lot of the commentary after the fact seemed to paint this picture of there being an initial strike on the boat and then Hegseth intervening and saying, hit it again, kill them all. That appears not to, subsequent reporting suggests that that's not the case. Whatever is the case is, at least to me in this moment, a bit murky. Who precisely ordered what and according to what rules of engagement and what broader rationale. Like, I think you'll see Republicans react downstream of whatever those facts prove to be. Because like no one's defending in principle, at least sitting here today, the act. Well, no one overstates it. No one in the administration, to include the president, as best as I can tell, is defending a second strike that was somehow for the purpose of killing two people who were, I guess, technically shipwrecked according to the
president.
The
in his defense, the president said, "I wouldn't have wanted that." I think was his exact phrasing. But I will say, Pete Hegseth, in those initial hours after the Post reported this, was sort of a bold and brash, as he is in virtually every instance, about this, and said, we've just started killing these narco-terrorists. Totally unapologetic. It's his own position now seems to be evolving, maybe because he realizes that he could be in real trouble, depending on where these facts lead. Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you talk about the facts? Will the response from Republicans will depend to a certain extent on what the facts tell us. Are you confident that we will eventually get the facts? There appears to be more video of what happened that we have not yet seen publicly. Do you expect that we will see those things? And if it's the case that somebody like Wicker, who I agree with you is a serious guy, says he's going to participate or help lead an investigation, do you think he will follow through? Will it be a serious investigation? Because we've seen, I think, a lot over the last 10 months, particularly among Republicans in Congress. They will express concerns about something or say that they are willing to challenge on the tariffs or Liberation Day or whatever. And then when it comes time to vote against them, there's not as much follow through. Do you expect that we would see, led by Senator Wicker or potentially Mike Rogers in the House, a serious investigation that is really determined to find the facts on these things?
They certainly seem to me to be taking it seriously. And look, it's hard to say, without the video ourselves or without testimony as to what was said by who and to whom, exactly what to conclude. I mean, can we imagine rationales for a second run at that boat that are separate from a desire to kill the two remaining people? I guess so. I could imagine it. I also think the head of Special Operations Command, who appears to have had some kind of operational control over the mission. That's a very serious person. A guy who's commanded, not only JSOC but what's known as SEAL Team 6 in his time. Like, this is a serious guy. These are not insubstantial people, and so yeah, I mean, I'm a fan of the Republicans on the Hill, whose names you've mentioned, and they seem to be taking it seriously to me.
Let me conclude with sort of a big picture question and go back to something that we discussed just briefly earlier in our conversation, and kind of made light of, but I think is actually a very serious thing. There was this podcast episode that Tucker Carlson hosted with a historian. We call him a revisionist historian in the most charitable possible description, but somebody who said that, in effect, Winston Churchill was the bad guy in World War II, that what happened, the Holocaust sort of happened by accident, that this was, that Adolf Hitler was maybe misunderstood. When you hear that, given the time that you devote to studying, understanding war, I guess, what's your reaction to something like that on a podcast as popular as Tucker Carlson's is, number one, and number two, what does it say to you that he seems to be able to persuade some people that that's right? Are we just so far removed from World War II that people don't remember what it was about? What explains sort of the lack of understanding? I would say particularly among young people who are sort of at the heart of Tucker's audience.
Yeah, I'm very alarmed. Abraham Lincoln gave this great speech as a young politician in the 1830s, speech to the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, in which his subject is the disorder, the proliferating disorder in American cities and beyond in that decade. And he's sort of in search of a deep cause for it, and he proposes that the deep cause is the disappearance of the revolutionary generation, who by the 1830s are gone. With their disappearance, America's lost his phrase, the living history that connects us essentially, to the project of the Republic. Beautiful speech, important speech, sort of defines a lot of what will drive him for his career. I think we are living in a moment where something similar is true about the disappearance of the World War II generation. Those guys served as a kind of connection to some hard truths about politics, international politics, global affairs, war, whatever you want to call it, that were really important. And with their disappearance, something actually significant seems to have been lost. Not that, I'm actually, open to criticisms of the greatest generation. Jim Webb actually had a great piece. It's like 20 years ago now. A great piece complaining essentially about generational stereotypes and how the greatest generation get all the praise, and his generation, the baby boomers, catch a lot of flack. And he points out, I was like, last time I checked, I'm pretty sure it was the greatest generation that sent me to war in Vietnam. And all the kids, all of whom were volunteers in my platoon, who were dying all around me, were baby boomers, which is a point well taken. Like, the greatest generation was certainly capable of policy errors. But that America twice in the 20th century, World War I and then World War II, had this experience of attempting to stay out of Eurasian affairs, only to discover that it actually had an interest in security in Eurasia, that ultimately these crises would affect us. And so in 1945, making the decision to stay. And then obviously the Cold War, which emerges shortly thereafter, sort of blocks that in a very robust way. The source of my alarm is that, I think if you're Tucker Carlson or Daryl Cooper or one of these guys whose basic position, right, is to kind of hate America, right? You're seeking a kind of revolution in America. You're seeking a white revolution in the old sense of the term, that is, not a racial sense, a white revolution in the sense of a counter revolution, counter to the Red Revolution, a conservative revolution in American affairs, where we move past liberalism into some new model. Well, to do that, you need to erode the foundations not only of American foreign policy, but of America's self-understanding. And American national heroism in World Wars I and II, and especially II, is foundational. And it's a smart strategy. This is why I'm alarmed. It's a smart strategy to erode it, to kind of make black white and up down and foul fair and the other way around. Because in the chaos and confusion you create, it gives you the opportunity to build new foundations and a new account of a middle 20th century where America made all the wrong calls, where actually the Nazis deserved a second look, where actually Adolf Hitler wasn't all that bad, where it was the British Empire that was bad, and we would have been better off not getting involved. This is all sort of old Pat Buchanan stuff. There's nothing really all that innovative about the line of thinking. What's alarming and striking about it is how potent and widespread it suddenly is. And I think that puts the burden on those of us who have the more old-fashioned view of what happened in those decades to make the case and make the argument and remind people and try to fill in the gaps left by our, sadly inadequate educational system, of telling the story of what happened in those years. Not only because I do think America comes off pretty heroically in that story. The reality is nuanced, and not everything is black and white, but on balance, I think that's the truth. But because I think the conclusion that we came to in 1945, that one way or the other, we'd rather not do this again, was the correct one. And policy should be downstream. And if we don't remember just how bad it was, if we don't remember, we've had a fair amount of war in my lifetime in the United States. I served in Afghanistan. I lost Marines in Afghanistan. Every American serviceman who died in Iraq and Afghanistan, was a father, a son, a daughter, a mom, etc. Every single case is a tragedy, but the total number of Americans killed in Iraq and Afghanistan is a rounding error, practically, in terms of the combat death toll of World War II, and a very, very small proportion of the American combat death toll in World War II. And tragedies like that can happen again. And you got to revive the knowledge of that history to keep people serious about the imperative of preventing it.
Mm. Well, that's very well put. And one of the places where you've done this is a terrific essay in Engelsberg Ideas about your father, whom we discussed earlier. We'll be sure to put that in the show notes. It's a terrific read. I commend it to everyone. Aaron, thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Steve, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.